Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T Calkins-Treworgy, also known as Byron of Sidious. The following is a presentation of a fanfiction tale written and recorded by yours truly. This is Corrupted Shield, a Castlevania fanfiction work by Joshua T Calkins-Treworgy. Part 1. The work continued, and yea, the earth did shake with that thunder. The tremor that made its way to the northern outskirts of the village of Volanche troubled not the heart of Father Jacob Douglas, who in point of fact felt a slight tug of a smile at the corner of his mouth. It informed him only that the men at the work camp nearby had felled another tree for their near future use, as the village returned to the noble work of expanding to allow for its slow but steady repair and growth. Volanche had been well on its way to being the home of some 1,000 faithful souls, when the forces of wickedness had been unleashed upon the countryside almost half a year earlier. Now, even beset occasionally by the remnants of the personage most foul, responsible for that wickedness being draped over the lands like a black blanket, the village's men, women, and children had mostly returned to the lives they had always led. Lord Dracula and his accursed castle had been destroyed, sent back to whatever stretch of hell played home to it between reappearances. Father Douglas crossed himself silently as he thought back to those darkest days, when monsters appeared to rove and rampage across the lands of Transylvania, en route to the dreaded vampire's keep, to serve him and his evil machinations. Dreadful enough that he brought his own hordes from the pit, thought the preacher, as he went through the motions of blessing the water in the font near the doors of his beloved, if smallish, church on the village's north end. That he seems to draw out the evils ever present in the lands as well is more the trouble. He looked up toward the pulpit, where a wonderfully polished ash cross, carved and cared for by his own two hands, practically gleamed out from the front of his lectern. "Praise Jesus for the Belmonts," he muttered. Of course, like most common folk, he knew nothing of the fact that it had actually been the vampire lord's son, Alucard, who had bested his father's armies within the keep and drove it back to oblivion. All most knew, like Father Douglas himself, was that a Valmont had been witnessed traversing the lands from one of his clan's ancestral estates toward the castle, and shortly thereafter, said castle and forces of Dracula had been wiped from the world. Not all of Dracula's monstrous servants had vanished with him, however. Every now and then, an errant, singular creature or clutch of such abominations would wend through the lands, including Father Douglas's beloved Volanche. Mostly these were minor imps, undead skeletal soldiers, and the occasional wild, oversized feral wolf known as Warg, though 2 months earlier, a kind of shambling mound of flesh, the remains of various rats, squirrels, raccoons, and what some said were bats came crawling, mewling along through the woods to the western edge of the village. Harker Chambers, one of the logging camp workers, had happened upon the creature trying to attack his hunting dogs, and with woodman's axe in hand he had dispatched the wretch in a bloody frenzy, invoking the name of the Lord all the while. Neighbors who had witnessed the incident had spoken highly of the logger's courage in the face of the monstrosity, though Harker had come to the church the very next day to confess to Father Douglas that he had been almost stricken immobile by terror. Were only my terror that after it put paid to me, it would have gone on to slay mine wife and daughters, what made me able to move, father, the big man had croaked. I am no brave man, only unwilling to let such evil befall my family without resistance. And that, my son, is the duty of a righteous man, Father Douglas had replied, offering Harker both forgiveness and praise in the name of the Lord God. It had been God's grace that such a horror had chanced upon the Chambers property, and not that of someone like Leonard Preek, the lead woodsman of the village. The father had heard murmurings and seen with his own eyes proof of that man's capacity for petty tyranny, the sort who wields his physical strength and prowess not as a good and true shepherd and leader of men, but as a whip-cracker and abuser of authority. Like as not, he would have run from the beast to Harker and demand he deal with it, the preacher thought. No sooner had the words passed through his mind than he sighed, chastising himself for the uncharitability of such an idea. It is unkind to assume such things, he said quietly to himself. Forgive me, Lord. With the font's water blessed, Father Douglas, himself a man of only early middle years, swiftly strode down the central aisle toward the pulpit, canting slightly to the right for a doorway into a storeroom. His own private quarters were nestled back behind the main chamber of the church itself, complete with a separate exterior door leading to a mean little garden, from which he had yet to wrestle more than some scrubby potatoes and carrots the last few years. The preacher knew he was no green thumb at heart, but ever did he try. No, he knew well enough that the skills that he had been tutored in as a child by his own father were put to good and honest endeavor in the Lord's eye, a notion once more confirmed as he looked upon the tables and shelves of the storeroom. Each shelf and small table was laden with various woodworking tools, as well as trays with fine horsehair painter's brushes and stoppered jugs full of various stains, varnishes, and paints. Father Douglas nimbly took up a clean brush, a jug of polish, and slung a pair of recently laundered buffing towels from the shelves over his shoulder, taking these out into the pews. The 2 rows nearest the front doors of his church were beginning to look a little worn, thanks in no small part to the village's most frequent supplicants, always taking up the space there, and he wished his flock to see his efforts and appreciation in not only his sermons and ministrations to their spirit, but to their too human sense of pride and decency. Pride in excess is a sin, yes, but one must show care, which is another thing altogether, he reminded himself, setting up to his simple task. The smell of the polish took him back in his mind to those many afternoons spent training with his father, apprenticing even after he had declared his intention to the old man to become a priest. A man of God should still be a man capable of work, boy, his father had replied, accepting young Jacob's plans without a hitch. Now, pay attention. The memory brought its own quiet joy, which he worked within for long enough to get most of the rearmost pew polished up, before one of the 2 doors banged open abruptly, a young man from the village standing in the archway, looking aghast at Father Douglas. The preacher stood up straight to face the visitor, eyebrow raised. Young Mr. Tarkin, what urgency brings thee crashing into the house of God so brusquely? Father Douglas asked firmly, though carefully keeping too much iron from his tone. Father Douglas, it's my wife Melanie. Her quickening, the young man gibbered, his hands visibly shaking at his sides. Oh, goodness, 'tis good call for thy manor, said the preacher with a grin, quickly plugging the stopper back in the jug of polish and setting his brush and towels on the floor of the row. Come, we should away to midwife Leighton's house and take her to Melanie's side, as well as Dr. Gatchlow, who blissfully lives beside. Follow me, Mr. Tarkin. A joyous day lies before us. The sun had almost gone down on the village when little Millicent Tarkin joined the world, her first cries bringing tears of joy to the eyes of Melanie and James, her parents, as well as those of midwife Layton and Dr. Gatchlow, neither of whom had been well known as merrymakers in their own right. Father Douglas had departed from the Tarkin abode after the doctor assured him that the mother would survive the post-birth process, making his way almost immediately to the village's lone tavern to announce to those few occupants present the good news of the birth. "If any of you sees little Hans in the morning, ask him to carry the message about town that I'll be giving a celebratory sermon at the church the next day." The small handful of local drinking men, most of them the woodsmen and hunters of the village, assured him they would locate the town's young crier and deliver the task unto him. By candlelight, after supping on a simple stew for his dinner, the preacher wrote of the witnessed childbirth in his journal, a magnificently handcrafted item he had received from the village's prior church leader when he took over the little flock that was Volanche's faithful, allowing the elder preacher to return to his own hometown in the east. "I had hoped my own would not fill too quickly, and this one could be given to my successor," the wizened old man had told him, as he handed Father Douglas the leather-bound book and a pair of fine quills, before clambering upon his small wagon, tethered to a pair of ruddy but dutiful mules. "Thank you, Father Edmonds." "Go with God," Douglas had said. "Stay with God, young Douglas." Yes, life had been fraught with peril during the time that Lord Dracula's castle had been much too close to the village. But with that time now far enough removed from the day's events, Father Douglas found his quill moving swiftly as he briefly recorded the blessed birth of the village's newest denizen. He mused that he would have to take one of the new writing implements with him in the morning, when he intended to take a short hike into the woods surrounding the village, to let his mind wander upon and try to assemble the proper words for a sermon to celebrate the newborn among the flock. Still, he didn't mind. His best original messages had ever been inspired by the beauty of the nature that surrounded Volanche during such walks. Rising the following morning to the echoing calls of roosters from the Hastings farm, located not far south of the village proper, Father Douglas sprang to with an eagerness. Into a gunna bag he set his journal, two of the pens a traveling merchant had traded to him some weeks earlier for a couple of coin, and some salted meat and a wedge of cheese, as well as a filled water skin and some dried bread. He also placed a compass within, in the event he should become confused in his directions, and to his belt he tied a small coin purse, in the unlikely event he should cross paths with a merchant whilst out and about on his hike. He might have left his small dwelling then, but caution, ever the better part of valor, stayed him a moment longer, as he fetched a simple woodworker's mallet from his storeroom. It wouldn't be the best of defenses in the wild, but it would serve his purposes if he should be set upon by any of the woodland's lesser animal threats. As he stepped outside, he heard the loud public calls of little Hans, the town crier, walking about town and delivering his message. "Aye, there's a good lad," he thought cheerfully, setting foot on an older, half-hidden hiking trail into the woods, right off of the back of his garden. Morning birdsong drifted along the air as he strode down the path, taking a leisurely pace in order to pause here and there to properly take in the beauty and bounty of the wooded countryside around Volanche. Pressing on a little way further north, he shortly came alongside the river tributary stream, which provided the village with most of its water, halting in his tracks as he spotted a sizable, reddish buck lapping from the clean, slow-moving stream. All Dern Perth would give thanks for such a clear line of sight, he thought, musing that the village's most talented hunter would also likely already have notched an arrow and let fly in the time it took the preacher to simply admire the animal before continuing along the path as quietly as he could. It was perhaps an hour after leaving the village that he strayed slightly off of the path, fetching himself a seat on a fallen log among some heavy underbrush and bushes to take a few bites of salted beef and drink from his water skin. The drone of local insects played its own curious song around him, which Father Douglas enjoyed for a few minutes before a different sound caught his attention. Something heavy in the thicket off to his left pulled his eyes that way, and at first he saw nothing untoward. Another indistinct sound, followed by rapid movement, and then came a flurry of motion in his direction as a dozen or so small animals, including another of the red deer of the region, streaked by him on either side, issuing sounds of panic and terror as they practically stampeded blindly away from the source of the first noise that had caught his ear. "What oddment be this?" he muttered aloud, cinching up his gunna bag back over his shoulders and rising from the log. His right hand, seemingly of its own volition, slid towards his mallet, which he drew from its loop on his belt. The smell of the animals that had just fled by him lingered, a wild aroma, but along with this he detected a faint hint of something else with a sniff, something like old dust. Another noise of something large moving heavily through the brush ahead of him set his teeth on edge, his pulse thrumming in his head. As he moved around a heavy ash tree in his way, Father Douglas finally saw clearly what had so horrified the wildlife moments earlier. Stalking slowly, steadily through the trees and foliage came a figure in a towering suit of armor, its heavy plates the color of a clear sky in early evening, a dark blue that verged on purple. In one hand the figure carried an enormous double-headed war axe, a slightly curved siege shield half dragging along the ground in its right hand as it maneuvered clunkily along. A flowing white cloth sash was bound around the figure's waist, and a flaring blood-red plume of feathers stood atop its helm. By itself this would not stir in him apprehension, for the lands of Transylvania hosted many as the brave warrior, most of whom had impressive armaments. The open helm, however, revealed no human occupant to move it. Well, that certainly explained Father Douglas's immediate, almost bladder-relaxing terror upon the creature's open-faced helm snapping without warning in his direction, as if the creature had seen him. A thundering rumble, like the snarl of a warg, the monstrous wolves that often accompanied the servants of Count Dracula, issued forth from the armored apparition as it squared itself directly at the preacher. Father Douglas wheeled about and sprinted back toward the log he'd been seated upon, his mind racing. "An axe lord," he panted in his mind. "Merciless demons without equal. But how did it survive the banishment of Dracula's castle?" There was no time to consider the question, for Father Douglas's booted foot caught on a tree root, and he lost his balance, pitching forward with a yelp to crash to the woodland floor. He groaned from the pain of the fall, rolling onto his back and immediately scurrying like a crab away from the lumbering, animated armor, which had drawn to within 10 yards of him. "In Jesus' name, I pray thee save me, O Lord," he rasped, fetching up against an unseen tree behind him, shifting up to his feet at least. He clasped his hands together before himself and bent his head in silent prayer. He might outrun the beast momentarily, but he knew full well the ruthlessness of such evils. Better to die in worship than survive momentarily in fear of the enemy and his minions, Father Douglas thought. He felt the tremors under his feet as the axe lord drew nigh, smelled clear now the combination of dust and blood that wafted from its plated body, heard the clank and scrape of its movements. And after a full minute of silent prayer, he realized that the movement had ceased. The preacher risked opening his eyes, finding himself staring up at the living armor, its empty helm angled down at him. Though not exactly a small man, at nearly 5'9", the preacher was nevertheless dwarfed in comparison by the axe lord, which easily measured 7.5 feet in height. As big around as a sentinel tree itself, the creature merely stood there, axe and shield in hand. "In God's name, what are you doing out here, demon?" Father Douglas asked. He had intended the inquiry to be rhetorical, but a rumbling voice of low thunder replied, from somewhere in the unknowable depths of the armored body. "Castle gone. Master gone," the axe lord intoned. Father Douglas nodded, aware now that one hand had gone to the simple cross necklace worn under his simple tunic shirt. Yes. The Belmont freed us from him, though not, as we've learned too often, from all of his minions. Which leaves me to ask again, why are you here?" The axe lord turned its helmet head toward the northwest, where the vampire lord's keep had been, then back toward the preacher. "Castle gone. Master gone. Need master." Father Douglas felt a new kind of fear thrust a needle into the small, hidden places of his mind, accompanied by a curious thought. What if this creature had happened upon some highwayman or brigand before crossing my path? Would the kind of brutish, merciless men who make their way in this world by preying upon the vulnerable hesitate to lash such a walking weapon to heal, to exploit as a tool of their will? He had no idea if the notion rapidly taking shape in his heart and mind would work. But at this point, what was there to lose? Only my life, if it should not work, and may the Lord welcome me to his side if it doesn't. "You need someone to serve, then?" "Yes," said the preacher. "I shall be your master, then," he proclaimed, releasing his fear and trusting his life and soul to God's mercy in that moment. He stood straight, hands loose at his sides, and gave the towering menace as neutral a stare as he could muster, given his rattled nerves. With metallic groans and grinding, the axe lord lowered itself to one knee and bowed its helmet head before him, arms held out to its sides. "Master," it rasped, a sickly purple aura of power flaring briefly up around it, an aura which reached out one tendril of smoky force to lap at the preacher's face. It carried with it the smell of old blood and heated steel. When the axe lord rose once more, it stood at the ready, as if for guard duty or battle. Father Jacob Douglas had come hiking into the wilderness to find inspiration and write a sermon celebrating newborn life. He had instead found something altogether else. Part 2. Very little time passed between when Father Douglas made his fateful decision to take on the role of the Axe Lord's master, and when he began to regret it. He had begun making his way back toward Volanche, pausing once more to look at the stream, which, again, was playing host to several woodland creatures as a watering hole. He tilted his head and observed one of the specimens. "That doe would make for an excellent stew," he remarked, looking at the female deer stood bent at the stream just the other side of the water. He let out a quiet harumph and shook his head, and a moment later he heard the grind and whoosh of something with great heft becoming airborne. With blank awe he stared as the axe-lord's weapon flew end over end with fierce weight and velocity, shearing the animal in twain right down the split of its body, the shining edge of the weapon passing as easily through fur, muscle, organ, and bones as a bird would pass through open air. A scarlet mist burst from the line of assault, and with a splash of innards and blood, the cleanly bisected animal dropped dead to the ground in opposite directions. The weapon itself made a perverse return flight through the air to the axe-lord's extended hand, the wooden shaft clapping snugly back into its grasp as the other nearby animals bolted for safety. Too stunned to move, Father Douglas watched in horrified amazement as the axe-lord marched to the stream, waded across it, the water only deep enough to reach around waist height at its deepest, and made its way to the fallen animal. The monstrosity put its axe through a loop on its wide brown belt and hoisted its tall shield over its shoulder, anchoring it onto some sort of hook. It then reached for the curve of its breastplate, pulling open an unseen hinge, revealing a swirling void of crackling purple and blue force, a visible corruption wriggling in a reality itself. The axe-lord then crouched down and pulled the fallen deer's dripping, sloshing halves into itself, the material vanishing into that pocket of space. When it was finished, the axe-lord eased its armor shut and rose, leaving behind only some scraps and fluids from its prey upon the ground. As it returned across the stream, Father Douglas felt his gorge rise at the sight of the specks of blood and viscera that had dribbled on its cuirass, wash away clean in the running water of the stream. When it stood once more before him, the axe-lord used its now empty hand to gesture toward the path, that Father Douglas might once more lead the way onward, toward home. "God help me. I am both afraid and fascinated," he thought, allowing himself to wonder about the bizarre magics that must be involved in both animating the axe-lord and allowing it to carry its kill in a fashion beyond the material. He wondered briefly, trying to ignore the absence of insect noises and bird song since the beast began following close behind him, what other limits or restrictions lay upon what sort of materials and how much of them could be stored and transported inside of the walking armor suit. He was perhaps 20 minutes' distance from the village when he realized, with a start, that he had written down nothing for the sermon he wished to share with his flock the following morning. So spellbound by his encounter with the axe-lord and the scene at the stream was he, that he had neglected entirely this promised duty. He cast his sight towards the sky, which he considered a moment to try and estimate the time of day. "I should partake of mid-meal and try to write something," he mused aloud to himself, looking around for a likely spot in the wooded surroundings to sit and nibble on his cheese and bread, whilst he searched for the words to write down for his sermon. He looked up at the axe-lord and addressed it. "Step over here with me, what should I call you?" The creature simply tilted its head slightly left, showing no sign of having understood the question. "Do you have a name that you answer to?" "Name," the creature rumbled. No name." Father Douglas cast his mind back through his biblical knowledge, trying to conjure up a label that would seem fitting. It didn't take long for him to come to one that struck him as appropriate. "I shall name you Cain, given your wandering and banishment from the realm from whence you come," the preacher declared. "Now, come, Cain. I have work to do," he said, walking into the woods far enough off of the path that he would be unseen by travelers if they should happen by upon it. The axe-lord, Cain, dutifully followed with him. Once Douglas settled with his back against a tree, the creature drew out its shield and axe, stepping a few paces away, and seeming to survey the area, a posture befitting a sentry. From his gunna bag beside him, Father Douglas drew out his leather-bound journal, one of his pens, and some of the cheese and bread, as well as a couple of strips of salted beef and his water skin. The preacher cast his mind back to the recent childbirth, thinking too about all of the village's children whom he had seen come into the world, the baptisms he had performed upon most of them. Even if the parents did not routinely attend his services, all in the village respected his vocation and their shared faith, always extending warm wishes to Father Douglas in passing. This recollection inspired his pen to begin its work, and before long, the preacher had a suitably celebratory message to pass along to his parishioners when next he stood before them at his lectern. When he finally tucked the journal away, he was startled by the lateness of the hour, the afternoon already swiftly moving toward evening. He quickly took care of his necessary behind another tree, hoping the axe-lord would stay put while he did his business, then motioned for Cain to follow him back to the path. The axe-lord kept good enough pace just a few steps back from him along the way, with the preacher looking back to double-check on the creature every now and then. It was due to this frequent checking that he did not notice right away that the woodsman of the village had joined him on the path back to Volanche, just a dozen yards ahead of him and his newfound servant. Even from behind the man, he recognized the voice of Leonard Preck, the lead woodsman, as he harangued his men for wishing to end their work for the day before the sun set. "We could have felled another 2 oaks if we'd kept on just a little longer, but you lazy lot are too afeard of the dark," he barked. "That's for good cause, given the evils that lurk these woods even now that the bloodsucker's castle's gone," one of his men remarked back over his shoulder. Father Douglas did not see Harker Chambers among the workmen, a point for which he was grateful when the speaker, having spied him behind the group, sent up a wave of greetings toward him. "Hullo there, Father Douglas! Who's this knight what travels with you?" The rest of the woodsmen ceased in their tracks and turned one by one to consider the preacher and his companion, whom he hoped would not draw too much close scrutiny. "Ah, yes, this is Sir Cain, a traveling warrior," the preacher replied, approaching no closer to the woodsman. "I came upon him whilst out hiking earlier today. He said he was looking for a place to take some rest in the area, and I invited him to come to the village for a day or two, to rest until he is ready to once again hunt monsters in the region." Preck planted his hands on his hips and squinted at the axe-lord, a grin tugging at his darkly whiskered lips and jaw. "It's a fine axe he's got there, Padre. Sir Cain, if you need some extra coin, we could use a big man like yourself for a couple of extra working days. I'm short a man right now," he said, striding toward the priest and creature, giving the axe-lord a slower up and down. "What say you?" Father Douglas felt a depthless chill spread through his chest as a low rumble rolled from the axe-lord beside him, an unmistakable sound of displeasure. "I must intervene, now," he thought. He took a step to put himself between Preck and the creature, bringing one hand up loosely to stay further dialogue. "I'm certain Sir Cain needs his rest, Mr. Preck," he said meekly. The bigger man grabbed Father Douglas's upraised wrist tightly, pulling a poisonous face at the preacher. "This is business, Padre. Let the big man speak for himself, he snarled, roughly twisting Father Douglas's arm and shoving him to the dirt. When the preacher turned over and sat up, Preck was glowering down at him, while behind Preck, the axe lord had drawn back his massive shield. As the lead woodsman pivoted toward Cain, the axe lord slammed the shield full force into him, driving him with a shocked grunt down to the ground just a couple of feet away from the preacher. And it did not stop there. With a scrape of metal, the creature pressed with its unholy strength and weight downward, birthing the noise of a man's entire skeletal structure breaking and pulverizing under pressure it was never designed to withstand. The preacher watched in frozen disgust as broken bones thrust bloody tunnels out through crushed flesh along the fallen man's barely visible side under the force of the shield pressed down upon into him, a pool of Preck's life rapidly spreading around him. With a vacuous the axe lord rose back to standing, the front of its shield caked in scarlet. When faced with such supernatural brutality, men from all walks of life tend to have one of three reactions: recognize the danger and flee, recklessly charge in defiance of the obvious odds against them, or hesitantly retreat a little to better assess one's options. Of the 7 remaining woodsmen, 5 turned and hoofed it toward Volange without another moment's thought. 1 withdrew several yards away with wood-cutting axe in hand, and another man, just as broad and foolish as Preck himself had been, let out a primal battle cry and charged, his own woodcutter's axe drawn back for a maximum force swing. When the fool swung his tool at full force in a horizontal arc, it clanged against the axe lord's cuirass with hellish volume, but to no visible effect. Cain didn't even try to block the blow, and the armor that was his body didn't show any signs of the impact aside from the echo of the blow. The woodsman started to draw back for another strike, but he would get no chance to deliver it. As Cain abruptly pivoted and brought his own axe up and forth, cleaving the man at an angle from his left hip up to his right shoulder, the 2 portions of his body dropping in a trickle splash of gore to the dusty path. The creature hefted its shield up before it then, axe held at the ready, as it faced the man who had neither fled nor attacked. "God help me," this last man said, making the sign of the cross before himself as he withdrew several more steps. Cain did not pursue, simply remaining in place, at the ready, until the man turned and ran away. When he was a goodly 50 or so yards distant, the axe lord straightened up, sliding its axe handle back through the holster loop on its belt, shield held at its side. It took several moments for Father Douglas to recover his senses enough to climb to his feet, watching as the axe lord anchored its shield on its back and knelt by the dead men, rifling through their belts, pockets, and sling bags, pilfering their corpses. When it was done, it brought a pair of small coin purses and a pair of slender metal flasks to the preacher, who just stared at them. What is this?" he managed to rasp up at the creature. "Spoils belong to Master." In that moment, Father Jacob Douglas realized that he couldn't return to Volange, not with this monstrosity attached to him. It would regard anyone and everyone there as a potential threat to the priest, and this would result in the wholesale slaughter of the entire settlement. After all, nobody there could stand against a creature such as this. They were farmers, tradesmen, and merchants, by and large, common folk without the weapons or training needed to take on such a threat by themselves. The creature was presenting the possessions of its victims to him as if they were the earned wages of war. The wages of war are coin, he thought grimly, and the wages of sin are death. Part 3. Making the decision not to return to Volange had been easy enough. Figuring what to do now, however, was proving less simple. Father Douglas dipped his water skin into the stream to refill it, casting about for any signs of other people or wildlife near to hand. Of course, there was nothing to see, other than a few birds nested in branches up beyond the Axe Lord's lethal reach. So long as it was beside him, the preacher doubted any animal with a sense of self-preservation would draw close. Cain practically radiated deadliness and murderous intent. The situation he found himself in had to have some maneuverability, he reasoned, putting the stopper in his water skin once more and putting it back into his gun bag. He stood up, surveying the area, and spotted some spanleaf bushes just down the way from him. He straightened up and cleared his throat. Cain, fetch me some of that spanleaf. Enough to fill your hands. The living armor turned its head toward him, then toward the bushes. It looked down at him once more, nodded silently, and started tromping over to the spanleaf. Clumsily, it reached its metal hands among the branches and bramble, then wheeled toward Father Douglas, halting before him and lowering its open hands for him, filled with torn leaves and branches from the bush. Gracefulness would be asking too much, I imagine, he said with a sigh, reaching into the creature's hands and plucking out some of the less mangled leaves. These he placed in an empty pouch, then tied the pouch to his left hip. The creature could follow simple commands, it seemed. If only I had thought to command it to stop its attack on those men, he thought, choking down his self-recrimination. But what was I to do? It was too late to bring those fallen back, and the matter of warning the village would be handled by the survivors of that incident. Father Douglas himself now had to figure out what could be done about Cain without involving others, lest they be put at risk of harm from the monstrous armor creature. Moreover, he had to figure out how to survive in the wilderness, since keeping Cain away from his fellow man would necessitate staying away from settlements. He decided that a direct approach should be tried first. Cain, you have demonstrated an ability to broadly understand me, he said, starting to walk along the stream's bank toward the northwest, opposite the run of its current. The creature strode along parallel to him, serving as a flanking presence to his left, opposite the water. Do you understand that I am human? Yes, Master Human, the Axe Lord rumbled. And do you understand that I must occasionally rest and take shelter from the elements? Yes, humans, frail. Unflattering, but accurate, I must say. Cain, I have no tent with me in my gunna. Moreover, I have limited supplies. I only intended to come out for a morning hike when I came upon you. Most of my food is already gone, and I have no means of striking up a quick camp. The Axe Lord made a low, growling sound deep in its hollow body, and stuck one arm out to its side to stop Father Douglas in his tracks. It stepped around him and then shuffled back several paces, pulling its cuirass open once again to reveal the swirling void of magic within itself. One of its gauntlet hands reached into the swirl and withdrew from within its unknowable depth what appeared to be a tent roll, bound in ropes that each terminated in an anchoring stake, which it dropped to the ground. Then it reached in again, coming out with a block of flint and a thin plate of striker steel, dropping these as well beside the bundled tent. Father Douglas considered these a moment, as the creature then reached into itself one more time, drawing out what looked like a chunk of cooked turkey leg on a pristine white platter. This last it set on the ground gently, before clapping its torso shut once more, then stepping back and holding one open hand down toward its retrievals. "Serve, master," the axe lord intoned. Useful sorcery, this. But sorcery it remains, the preacher thought. Can I use such things and remain free of their wickedness, their taint? Lord, forgive me. I fear I have no other choice. The priest moved up to the platter and sat down on the springy grass beside the stream, daring to take a bite of the turkey leg. To his pleasant surprise, the food was both warm and delicious, though he had to fight down the urge to inquire of Cain where it had come from. With the food bolted down and some water from his skin, the preacher felt the inexorable drowsiness from the day's bloody excitement crash over him like a tidal wave. He began trying to set up the tent, but was quickly and firmly shoved aside by the axe lord, which then proceeded to set up the tent with the skill of one for whom such menial labors had become second nature. When it had finished, it held one flap open for the priest, who started to duck down into it, pausing to glare up at Cain. I will rest within until nightfall. When I awaken, I will figure out our next move. Until then, what will you do? Guard, master, the axe lord replied in his echoing tone. Using his own gunna bag as a pillow within the tent, Father Jacob Douglas was quickly asleep, the only sounds around him the soft babble of the stream, and the song of birds staying well out of his servant's reach. When he finally woke, the preacher spent the first little while of his wakefulness writing in his journal the events of the day, doing the best he could to minimize the details of Cain's savage capacities. When he came up out of the tent, the axe lord immediately set to work undoing it, rolling it back up and storing it away once more in the void within itself. Whilst documenting this strange day, the preacher had been considering how it was that the Belmont, during his holy battle against Dracula and his accursed castle, must surely have faced and destroyed several creatures such as Cain. Thinking on this, he had been blessed by a revelation by the Lord. I can lead this abomination right to the Belmont estate and rid the world of its carnage. He knew full well that the grounds of the clan Belmont's lands were a several days' journey north and east of Volange, and that the going would be a struggle. Making his way whilst avoiding people would prove challenging, but it could certainly be done if he was but mindful in his journey. Father Douglas stretched and felt an immediate discomfort rumbling in his guts. A good thing I got those span leaves, he muttered to himself, one hand moving to his stomach. Cain, remain right here. I needs must tend to an unpleasant necessary. The axe lord made one of those deep rumbling noises of understanding, as it inclined its helmet head in a nod, and Father Douglas started off into the thicket to find a likely tree to lean back against. The whole ordeal took only a few minutes, but the priest could not deny that his spiritual turmoil was likely at least partially to blame for his bowels turning to water. The corruption in which that turkey leg had been sealed away might well have played a factor as well, but the depth of his knowledge of such magics was only modest at best. He could not claim to honestly know how much weight to place upon that factor. As he drew his trousers up once more and tied them in place, stepping away from the tree, he took a moment to observe that Cain had indeed not followed him, remaining back over by the stream. I have my gunna, and he's not right here. For a fraction of a moment, he considered attempting the coward's answer and making a break for it, running as far and as fast as he could back toward civilization. No, I cannot shirk my duty. Even if I ran, it would likely track me down wherever I went. Still, the preacher decided to take a few more minutes to himself, wandering further into the woods alone. When he heard the snap of a branch nearby, he let out a sigh and said, "Well, I suppose you'll always end up back by my side, won't you, Cain?" As he turned his head to look to the axe lord, however, Father Douglas's mind loosed an inaudible howl of fear, for the living armor was not what had drawn upon him. Standing just a few yards away from him was a towering lizard man, a spear held at the ready for the hunt. It wore only some kind of animal skins on its lower torso, and its scaled upper body was crisscrossed with wide swaths of scar tissue, forked tongue rasping out between its blunted lips as it tasted the air. Blood-red eyes stared at the preacher as it bore down toward him, and once more Father Douglas silently begged the Lord's intervention. The air between the lizard man creature and the preacher shimmered with a pulse of purple-black force, and from the pulse strode the axe lord, the sound of its traversal like wet parchment being torn apart, rendering the distance between where it had been and its master's side meaningless. As the lizard man's spear thrust forth, Cain's shield swung out, catching the weapon and glancing it aside. The axe lord stepped fully out of the rift then, which faded away from mortal view, swinging his axe at the lizard man. The second monstrous beast, nimbler and more combat-ready than any mere woodcutter, dodged away from the blow ably, hissing at the axe lord, over which it had a good foot in height advantage. "I am witnessing titans of evil and madness clash," the preacher thought, his mind on the verge of breaking at what he beheld. The lizard man spun its weapon high overhead, stomping forward and swinging the spear in a broad arc from the side. The axe lord met the attack with the flat of his axe, punching out with his shield, but once again the lizard man slid back out of the way. With a flicker, it also thrust the tip of its spear into the gap between shield and arm, levering the shield out of the axe lord's hand and casting it aside. Father Douglas had little concept of battle, but he could well see that the reptilian monster had the advantage here. If Cain was felled, surely the preacher would follow soon after, and in much bloodier and more horrific fashion. The priest cast about for a rock or a stick, something to throw at the lizard man as a distraction. Finding nothing suitable, he finally took the woodworking mallet from its loop on his hip, took aim, and hurled it with what force he had at his disposal. His timing proved fortuitous. The creature had been in the process of angling for a new thrust at the axe lord when the mallet struck it a glancing blow upside the head. The lizard man stutter-stepped to its side out of blind reaction, which granted Cain an opening, the axe lord lunging forward and using its empty left hand to punch its foe with enough raw force to crush its face inward. The lizard man stumbled back, barely keeping its feet as the axe lord followed the blow with an overhead strike of his axe to the creature's shoulder, the sharpened edge of the axe head cleaving the arm off entirely. With a thud, the arm and spear fell to the ground, and the axe lord did not relent, raining further blows down upon its victim repeatedly, each subsequent blow splattering blood and the sounds of squelching death through the forest. Father Douglas had turned away the moment the lizard man's arm had fallen to the ground, unable to bring himself to witness the remainder of the carnage. He should have felt relief that his own life had been spared by his dark protector. Instead, his heart howled with guilt that he had lashed himself to the cruel thing that was at that moment rendering pure slaughter across God's sacred nature. Evil or no, the lizard man surely didn't deserve the fate being meted out against it, did it? It would have killed me for the sheer pleasure of it, or to harvest for its own meal. Would that have been better? Can the Lord forgive my earthly vessel's rescue at the hands of such an abomination as Cain? He had no answer for this question, and as the axe lord returned to his side, coated in the fallen creature's lifeblood and flecks of scaled flesh, Father Douglas lost what little remained of the turkey leg he had consumed before his afternoon nap. Part 4. Keeping well off the common roads, but staying parallel to them in order to maintain direction, Father Douglas led his stomping sentry through the countryside for most of the night, pausing only once before sunrise to try eating the last of the bread and cheese he had packed himself at his church. He did not entertain the idea of trying to run away from the creature, given what had happened with the lizard man. Said incident proved to him that no matter how far he might go from the Axe Lord, it would use the strange tie its devotion bound him with the preacher to in order to cross all distances. Father Jacob Douglas of Volanges was cursed. As the sun rose and the priest ducked out into his tent once more, he wrote as much in his journal. To the wretched thing that I have dubbed Cain I am lashed, for good or ill. It is my most fervent prayer that upon reaching the grounds of the Belmont estate, one of those worthy descendants of their bloodline might sense the creature's approach, and come out from wherever they may be on the grounds to lay it to waste. In Jesus' name I pray, and give over all hope to the Father above in heaven. His pen stopped and tucked back in his gunna bag with the leather-bound diary. The preacher lay down to sleep, with the hope of no dreams. If indeed the Lord still smiled down upon him, Father Douglas took it as a sign of such that when he awakened later on, it was to a feeling of having rested peacefully, with no nightmares to accompany the unholy bond between himself and Cain. A small mercy, Lord, and I thank you for it, he mused as he came up out of the tent. Cain set to work swiftly once more, rolling up the tent, rope, and stakes, leaving the priest to consider what appeared to be signs around him of some sort of scuffle. He walked slowly over to a nearby tree and reached out, plucking a tuft of blood-wetted black fur from the bark. He held it up as he faced the Axe Lord. Warg, the creature rumbled quietly. It turned toward another nearby tree and plucked up a swollen green apple, extending it to Father Douglas, who responded first by craning his head up to look around. When he saw a sign of several more of the fruit in the branches of nearby trees, he took it with a nod and bit in, grateful for the sweetness of its juices. When he had finished eating, he tossed the core deeper into the thicket and set out once more parallel to the trade road off to his right. And around what he judged to be early afternoon, the preacher heard what he could easily identify as wagon wheels rolling along the trade road, perhaps 20 yards away, and he turned toward Cain with one hand raised. Wait here a moment. I wish to speak to the people passing on the roadway. Do not move from here unless you sense that I am in genuine danger, Cain. The living armor gave him a silent nod, and the preacher angled his way toward the road, spotting what was clearly a traveling merchant riding up on the bench of a drop wagon, in which the fellow would be carrying his wares. Careful not to spook the fellow, the preacher called out, Lo, merchant! Comes a man would pay for your time. With a tug on the reins, the two-horse team clattered to a halt, and the stout, puffy-cheeked fellow on the driver's bench twitched his smiling face this way and that, until his eyes landed upon Father Douglas, the preacher emerging from the tree line. Ah, a customer, and a fellow traveler from the look of thy garments, I should say, called out the merchant in good cheer. Tell me, my good man, what sort of goods are you in need of? Kime of Torna may have it in stock. What I have need of is no material thing, but I would happily part with these coin, Father Douglas said, jiggling the small coin purses that Cain had taken from the woodcutters who had been his first victims. Tell me, he said, pausing to pull his compass from his gunna, do you know where from here the Belmont estate is, and how far? Kimay of Torna's smile smoothed from theatrical to genuinely amiable, and the man gave a bob of his head. Father Douglas handed the man the coin pouches, which the merchant opened just long enough to look within. He tucked them into one of his own green-dark tunic pockets and cleared his throat. "My good sir, you are but a full day's travel on foot from the lands of those worthy warriors, due east and a little north of here along the road," said Kimay of Torna. "Now look, this is simple enough information, but you look like a man harried, so I'll offer you something extra for the coin." The merchant turned and reached back into his wagon, bringing out a paper-wrapped parcel the size of a smallish book. "It isn't much, but my wife bakes an excellent spiced bread. I've already wolfed half of it on this trip, and give you joy of the remainder." The merchant offered the small half-loaf down to him from his bench, and Father Douglas bowed his head in thanks as he accepted it. "God smile upon you with his blessings, my son," the preacher said. The merchant made the sign of the cross before himself. "And upon you as well, good traveller. Fare thee well." And with a twitch of the reins, the merchant was gone again down the road, leaving Father Douglas with a trace of hope in his heart. Passing through a sizable clearing in the woodland under the clear, crisp light of the moon overhead that evening, Father Douglas paused a moment, staring at the axe-lord as it turned itself bodily to face the west. It moved not an inch, simply staring off into the unknown distance. Using his compass as a reference point, it was a mere matter of a couple of minutes before the preacher recognized what had pulled the creature's attention. "Yonder stood thy prior master's castle, didn't it?" he asked of Cain. "Yes." A light breeze fluttered the tall scarlet plume stuck atop the creature's helm head. "It and he are gone, thank the Almighty." A rumble sounded deep in the axe-lord's hollow gut. "Yes, gone." The axe-lord slowly turned around to face the preacher once more, who pivoted and led the way onward once again. The odd duo were only back into the woods a few minutes when he paused again, to take a couple of bites of the merchant's generously given bread. Through more thicket and bramble he marched, keeping focused on the goal ahead, the Belmont estate. Surely he could not be much further from it now, if the merchant had aimed him rightly. When the sun began to rise once more, he paused to look back at Cain, the creature, of course, showing no signs of fatigue or wear. "I should rest," the preacher thought, "but I cannot. I must be rid of this thing." It was almost an hour later that the preacher risked a break from the woods to travel briefly along the trade road, and in so doing, elevated his hope from a flicker to a coruscating blaze. When he stepped out onto the road, he saw a wrought iron fencing across the way from him, a firm, towering barricade walling off what appeared to be a sprawling property with several structures upon it. An insignia stood out every few yards in the fencing, shaped into it, the Belmont family crest. "No," came a timorous rumble from behind him. Father Douglas wheeled about and saw the axe-lord's helm shaking slightly side to side, a pair of smoldering scarlet lights illuminating the helm from within. "No!" The preacher heard something in that depthless drone that he had not heard before, a hint of genuine emotion, of fear. The axe-lord took several steps back toward the tree line, and Father Douglas felt himself pulled by an unseen hand away from the fencing. "Yes," the preacher said in reply, turning himself around and stepping back toward the fence and down the roadway, toward the open gates at the head of a path leading to the main manor keep on the grounds. It felt like he had a rope cinched around his waist, tied at the other end to some unfathomable weight. This must be done. Again he felt the pull at his person, a pressure that rapidly accelerated to pain as he strained against it. He risked a look back at the Axe Lord and saw a translucent cord, the purple-black force that Cain had first brushed against him when he accepted the creature as his charge, and he its new master. The creature had both metal hands clasped around its end of this cord, leaning back with its full weight and raw might concentrated upon it. "Release me!" the Axe Lord roared, its booming voice echoing loudly over the area. The words came with no trace of command, but of a plea, begging for escape. In that moment, the preacher knew full well that he could, that all that was required for the pain to cease, for this nightmare to be over with no further cost, would be to say the words, "I release thee from mine service." As easily as he had erred in taking on this curse, he could be freed of it. Father Douglas turned to face the Axe Lord, clamped his own hands down upon the cord wrapped around himself, and said through his bared teeth, "Those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength." Growling, certain that he would be ripped in half at any moment, the priest of Volanche dragged himself backward. The Axe Lord bound to him, falling to the dirt road, facing away from him. As he came even with the open gates, Father Douglas watched the creature draw out its axe and attempt to use it as an anchor by burying it in the ground. But this was to no avail. Regardless of its unholy strength, the creature he had dubbed Cain was drawn along behind him. As he turned to face the manor ahead, Father Douglas spotted a tall, powerfully built young man charging toward him down the front path, garbed in a royal blue trencher tunic and billowing white trousers, a jangling chain whip held in his right hand. When the Belmont was 15 yards away, the warrior leaped up through the air with a battle cry, crashing down toward the Axe Lord, his legendary weapon arcing down, the spiked ball at its end pounding into the Axe Lord's helmet head, with a crunch that sounded eerily like the shattering of bones. The moment the Belmont drew back his weapon in a ready position once more, the Axe Lord's body began to dissipate, and the cord of power lashing Father Douglas to it burst apart with a flare of white light. The preacher fell back to the ground roughly, his exertions no longer pulling against anything, tangible or no. His body felt like it had been pummeled by skilled pugilists for too long a time, and with a groan he tried to sit up, but fell back, barely able to recognize the beauty of breathing clean, free air. The sun stung his eyes as he looked skyward, but it soon was blocked out, as the younger warrior kneeled beside and leaned over him. "Are you all right, old Dad?" the Belmont asked him. "What happened here? Who are you?" Father Douglas let out a dusty laugh, shaking his head slightly, the most he felt he could offer bodily at the moment. "I am Father Jacob Douglas of Volanche. As for what happened here, redemption, I hope, my son. Redemption for the hubris of a man who should have known better." Once more he tried to lever himself up, and with the Belmont's hand to help, he managed to get himself up into a seated position, looking at the darkened patch in the road where the Axe Lord had been felled, the deep grooves in the roadway from where its metal fingers and axe had dug in, endeavoring to halt the preacher's march. "I'm not sure I understand, Father," said the Belmont. "I'll tell you the whole tale, Lord Belmont. Let it serve as proof that the tools of evil are dangerous, even to men who mean well." Thus concludes Corrupted Shield. a fanfiction tale by yours truly. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. I ask that you take care of yourselves, and as always, keep reading.